At the dawn of the first millennium, the site of this sprawling city of more than 1 million souls was a sparsely populated part of the kingdom of a Celtic tribe known as the Dobunai. A fortified settlement of these Iron Age people is thought to have occupied Bar Beacon. From here, they could survey the surrounding countryside, keeping a watchful eye open for hostile approaches. Unfortunately for the natives, when the Roman legions invaded in 43 AD, seeing them coming was one thing, stopping them was quite another. With their superior weapons, discipline and ruthless efficiency, the Romans quickly established control of most of Britain. Crucial to their dominance was an expertly constructed system of highly defended roads that enabled troops to move around the country rapidly and keep the garrisons supplied. Also vital was salt, one of the few known food preservatives, available in large quantities at Droitwich. A network of routes known as saltways radiated from here to all parts of Roman Britain. One of these routes ran northeast over the Lickys. Another Roman road, Icknield Street, ran from Ulster through Redditch and met the Saltway at Metchley, near Harborne. Where the two routes converged, they built a large fort. Queen Elizabeth Hospital now occupies the site. Early in the 5th century, after nearly 400 years of occupation, Roman troops were recalled to defend Rome itself from barbarian attack. This left Britain a sitting duck for a new breed of invader. Tribes of Angles, Saxons and Jutes sailed across the North Sea, pushing the British further and further west, making their homes in the territories they took over. Many of these early Anglo-Saxon settlements have become suburbs of the modern city. Tun indicates a farmstead. Aston was the East Farm, and Norton the North Farm. Another hamlet grew up on the adjoining North Field. A Lee was a clearing in the forest. Borde was the leader of a group that settled at Borde's Lee. Another individual with his family group put down roots near a natural ford on the River Ray. His name was Beorm, and his settlement became known as Beorm Inga Ham, Beorm's people's home. An ancient route had, since prehistoric times, carried travellers over the surrounding marshes to the gravel ford on the Ray. The Dyke Path, as the route was known, became corrupted to Digbeth. As the land of the Angles developed, 7 major kingdoms emerged. Birmingham lay at the heart of the mightiest of them all, Mercia. In the 7th century, the Mercians abandoned Tu, Woden, Thor and their other pagan gods in favour of Christianity. Churches began to replace the old heathen shrines, and St Lawrence's at Northfield and St Edburga's at Yardley both stand on the sites of Saxon churches. Anglo-Saxon control of England came to an end in 1066 after William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings. The new king seized the estates of the old Saxon lords and shared them out amongst his own followers. A large tract of the Midlands, including Birmingham and the other surrounding manors, were given to William Fitzanscall, a Norman knight who had fought at Hastings and now ruled his vast estates from his stronghold at Dudley. By 1166, the little manor on the banks of the Ray was in the hands of Peter de Birmingham, who had married into the Fitzanscall family. De Birmingham bought the rights to hold a market every Thursday, and later for an annual 4-day fair at Ascensiontide, and another at Michaelmas, where the main product on sale was onions, which earned it the nickname the Onion Fair. Its market and fairs gave Birmingham the advantage over neighbouring manors, and the hamlet began to expand. By 1290, it needed a new church to serve the growing population. The Fitzanscolls hailed from Amiens in France, a town closely associated with St Martin, a 1st century saint who became popular in the Middle Ages. Birmingham's new church was dedicated to him, and, although the church has been rebuilt twice since then, the name has stuck. The de Birminghams also attracted new settlers to the expanding village. More inhabitants meant more rent. They made it easy for individuals to set up business here, unlike many townships, including nearby Coventry, where trade was tightly regulated by powerful guilds. This freedom encouraged men of enterprise and ambition to come to Birmingham. Among the many skills they brought with them was metalworking, and by the early 14th century, smiths and ironworkers were listed among the ratepayers. By now, a bridge had replaced the ancient ford that linked Birmingham with the neighbouring manor of Bawdsley. The River Ray was a temperamental beast, and frequent floods left refuse dumped on the lower south bank, which earned it the nickname Dirty End. This became Derrit End. Other street names provide clues to the area's medieval past. Moat Lane follows part of the course of a moat that encircled the house of the lord of the manor and the medieval parsonage. Heathmill Lane was the site of an ancient corn mill powered by the River Ray, and Floodgate Street recalls the gates that controlled the flow of water into the mill race. By the early 16th century, Digbeth was home to around 1,500 people, living in 200 timber-framed houses, many with workshops attached, where smiths hammered out metal goods that were sold all over England. Meanwhile, other townships in the region were developing their own identities. Norton was part of the royal estate and had acquired the prefix Kings. The ancient structure, known as the Saracen's Head, was the home of the royal representative, the bailiff of Kings Norton, who administered the manor, including a large area of wasteland and ancient woods to the northwest. This was the King's Heath. The eastern edge of Kings Norton Manor included Rednall Hill, part of a royal hunting reserve that encompassed the Lickey Hills. A medieval bridge carried the route to the hunting ground across the marshy Ray Valley, the Long Bridge that gave the surrounding settlement its name. The early 17th century saw the creation of one of the region's best known historic landmarks. Sir Thomas Holt was head of a prominent local family from Duddeston Manor. In 1618 he began building a grand new home in Aston, overlooking the parish church and tiny Aston village sitting on the banks of the River Tame. It was completed in 1635 and soon became a local focus of the bloodiest conflict ever fought on English soil. Years of friction between Charles I and Parliament finally developed into civil war when the King raised his standard at Nottingham in August 1642. King Charles spent the night of the 18th of October 1642 at Aston Hall, on his way to fight the first major battle of the war at Edge Hill. During his time in the area, the King is thought to have come to Bar Common to rally support. It's said that soldiers made a mound for the diminutive monarch to stand on. The district has been known as King's Standing ever since. When the Royal Army, camped in the grounds of Aston Hall, moved off the following morning, they were harried by men from Birmingham, which had come down on the side of Parliament, an alliance that was to prove disastrous. In addition to direct action against the King, the smiths of Digbeth were busy equipping the opposition. One blade mill alone on the Ray supplied 15,000 swords to the Roundhead army, but refused any to the Royalists. In the spring of 1643, news reached Birmingham that a 2,000-strong force led by Prince Rupert, the King's most ruthless general, was approaching. Birmingham's garrison comprised about 160 musketeers and a handful of cavalry from Lichfield, no more than 200 men in total. The Prince arrived at Camp Hill overlooking Digbeth on Easter Monday, setting up his headquarters at the Ship Inn. In the valley below, musketeers positioned themselves in the upper stories of buildings that lined Derrit End, and the cavalry braced themselves to defend Ray Bridge. Civilians were evacuated to the relative safety of Edgbaston. The Royalist cavalry raced down the hill and flung themselves at the hopelessly outnumbered defenders. Incredibly, they were forced back, once, twice, but at the third attempt they broke through. In the fierce hand-to-hand fighting that followed, the Royalist Earl of Denbigh was fatally wounded. Prince Rupert exacted a terrible revenge. Birmingham was systematically looted and its houses torched. When they came to a cottage in Milk Street, they found a family cowering in terror. Inexplicably, a man named Moore, his wife and 5 children had stayed behind. They were dragged from their home and beheaded, one by one, in the street. When his dastardly work was done, the Prince led his troops off towards Sutton. It was a grim scene that greeted the rest of Birmingham's inhabitants when they returned. They soon had the chance for retribution. In December 1643, with fighting in the district intense, a large parliamentarian force gathered in Birmingham and laid siege to Aston Hall. After 3 days of heavy bombardment, the Royalists inside surrendered and the hall was plundered. The balustrade of the main staircase still bears the scars of war. It was shattered by a cannonball. The first stage of the Civil War ended in 1649 with the arrest and execution of Charles I. A period of puritanical rule under Oliver Cromwell ended in 1660 with the restoration of Charles II. In an effort to curb the influence of the religious nonconformists that had played a major part in his father's downfall, the new king passed a law that banned them from practicing their faith in any incorporated towns. The law, though, did not stretch to places that were not incorporated, including Birmingham. Nonconformists flocked to these centres. It was said of Birmingham in the late 17th century, "It awarded almost perfect freedom to all who chose to come. Dissenters and Quakers and heretics of all sorts were welcomed and left undisturbed, so far as their religious observances were concerned." Not only were they free to practice their chosen religion, the old freedom to set up in business here continued. No trade unions, no trade guilds, no companies existed, and every man was free to come and go, to found or to follow, or to leave a trade just as he chose. Birmingham was emphatically the town of free trade. The people that flocked to Birmingham brought with them new skills that complemented the basic ironworking already well established here. Jewellery and gun making were among the new industries that evolved in the teeming streets of early 18th century Digbeth. By now, Birmingham was also expanding away from its ancient heart. Metal goods were being produced in the appropriately named Steelhouse Lane, and what was effectively a new town grew on the sandstone plateau overlooking the River Ray. A new church dedicated to St Philip was completed in 1715 to serve the expanding community. It lay in fields on the edge of town. The nearest buildings were in Bull Street, and Temple Row was created for access to the new place of worship. Temple Street led to a new street that ran down to the old town. Modern Birmingham was beginning to take shape, although countryside was still very much part of the scene. Cherry orchards still occupied one side of St Philip's churchyard. They later became a bowling green and an open-air theatre for strolling players who visited the town. They ultimately made way for Cherry Street. The banks of the River Ray, upstream from Digbeth, also provided a pleasant haven. grey willows whispered by the ray, where lovers dreamt and children played, in clean fields on a summer's day. One hindrance to further expansion of Birmingham's industries was the great difficulty in getting in and out of the place. It was miles from any navigable river, and the state of the region's roads was deplorable. The stagecoach journey to London took 2 days in summer and 3 days in winter. Transport companies never advertised times of arrival and always carried the proviso, God willing. It was therefore a major beneficiary of the 18th century transport movement known as turnpiking. Groups of businessmen joined forces to privately improve sections of highway, erecting turnpike gates and toll booths to charge those using them. In 1725, the Birmingham to Warwick Road was turnpiked, followed over the next few decades by those to Coventry, Ulster, Stratford, Hagley and to Bristol via Worcester. The journey to London was cut to around 16 hours. Birmingham's first major coaching inn was the Old Crown, and in the early days, miles to and from the town were calculated from here. At the peak of the stagecoach era, 10 coaches a day ran between Birmingham and London. Grand coaching inns sprang up along the main routes, and turnpiking had a major impact on the districts they passed through. The improved road to Ulster crossed the King's Heath, where the Cross Guns, now the Goose, provided rest and refreshment. A group of scattered cottages grew up around the inn, the beginnings of the suburb. 3 major hostelries stood alongside the Bristol Road near Northfield, and the hub of the village moved from its old centre to the new turnpike route. The same happened in Yardley after the new road to Coventry was created. The old hearts of Yardley and Northfield are now conservation areas. Birmingham's industries continued to expand, boosted by the easier access it now enjoyed. There was an increase in demand for homes and workshops, and in 1746 the Colmore family released part of their estate bordering the town for development of craftsmen's dwellings. The Colmore's mansion, New Hall, gave its name to the road leading to the suburb, which quickly filled up with manufacturers of metal goods, in particular buttons, buckles, guns and jewellery. The new development also accelerated the spread of the town away from Digbeth. By now, Birmingham's population was made up of a large number of people born and brought up with metalworking over several generations. Industry and innovation was in their blood, and beyond Birmingham's boundaries lay an increasingly hungry market for their products. One particular young Brummie metal basher was destined to change the world. Matthew Bolton's father had a workshop in Livery Street and leased Sarehole Mill in Hall Green, an old corn mill adapted to metal turning. When his father died, young Matthew took over the family business and turned his very considerable talents to developing it. Traditionally, Birmingham's industries relied on a host of small manufacturers producing a wide range of goods in small workshops, and the growing international demand was rapidly outstripping supply. Bolton began to develop methods of mass manufacturing a range of metal goods. In 1762, he opened his Soho manufactory on Handsworth Heath. This large group of purpose-built buildings housed numerous trades that were interlinked. Each had their own speciality, and partly finished products would travel from one set of skilled hands to another. As a result, high-quality products involving numerous processes could be produced in bulk. When Bolton met James Watt, he became fascinated by the development of steam power and urged Watt to design an engine for driving the lapping machines at his factory. The two men became partners in the production of steam engines here in Birmingham that sold all over the world and transformed the way manufacturing was carried on. By now, a third innovator had joined the team. William Murdoch developed gas lighting, and the Soho manufactory became the first in the world to be lit by this method, allowing production to carry on 24 hours a day. While Bolton, Watt and Murdoch were revolutionising industrial practices, other great minds were addressing the problem of moving bulky goods efficiently around the country. The success of the Bridgewater Canal that brought coal from pits at Worsley into Manchester had sparked off a new transport revolution. Until now, the roads from the Black Country into Birmingham presented a constant, laborious procession of carts and wagons bringing in the necessary raw materials. When the first canal opened from the Wensbury coalfields to a wharf in Summer Row in 1769, coal dropped in price from 18 shillings a tonne to just 4. Soon, Birmingham was at the hub of a national canal network with nearly 160 miles of navigable waterways in the immediate vicinity. As well as vast quantities of raw materials coming in from the Black Country, finished products could now be transported directly by boat to the major ports of London, Bristol, Liverpool and Hull for distribution worldwide. While a host of specialised skills could be found in Birmingham, some of the surrounding villages had taken up the more basic trades, in particular nail making. In Harborne and Northfield, for example, nearly every cottage had a workshop attached. Farm labouring was still the main occupation in the summer, but in winter nail making took over. Whole families toiled away from dawn till dusk, turning iron rod into nails. On Saturday mornings, the men would trudge off to town with the stock of nails the family had made during the week, exchanging them for a meagre wage and a new stock of raw material from the fogger, as the nailmaster was known. By now, the narrow streets around Digbeth were heaving with the homes and workshops of thousands of artisans. Metal bashing was thirsty work, and pubs and alehouses abounded in the area. Other popular pastimes were cockfighting and bull-baiting. The bull ring takes its name from the iron ring where bulls were tethered to be attacked by specially trained dogs. By the end of the 18th century, though, many people were turning against such barbaric sports, and Harris's Birmingham Gazette reported on an encounter between the two factions. On the day in question, the bull was baited in a field behind the Salutation Inn, Snow Hill, and in conformity with the wishes of the respectable inhabitants, the Birmingham Association, a body of militia voluntarily formed by the trading class, undertook the formidable task of capturing the bull and dispersing its tormentors. While the rough and tumble of Birmingham life took place around the Bullring and Snow Hill, high society focused on fashionable Bull Street. It was here, early in the 19th century, that John Cadbury opened an upmarket grocer's shop. He began to sell his homemade cocoa and drinking chocolate, a venture that soon outgrew the grocery business and has carried on growing ever since. Control of the markets remained in the hands of the lords of the manor until 1824, when they were bought by Birmingham's local authority, the Street Commissioners. Trading had traditionally taken place in the streets around Digbeth, but now became centred on the Bullring, where a new market hall was erected. Meanwhile, Birmingham had continued to expand. In 1829, a new church dedicated to St Thomas opened to serve the growing community between Holloway Head and Five Ways. Apart from its churches, Birmingham had no buildings of any architectural merit, a situation the Street Commissioners decided to address. They put out tenders for a town hall, the grander the better. Out of various designs submitted, the committee chose a Corinthian temple-style building by a young architect, Joseph Hansom. The £19,000 cost was to be raised by a public levy, bolstered by private donations. Work started in 1832, with Hansom and his partner John Welsh as contractors. The project was beset by problems. 2 workers were killed when they fell from the roof, and Hansom's quote proved woefully inaccurate. £19,000 became £25,000. Hansom and Welsh went bust, and work was delayed until the difference was raised. Reclining casually on the steps behind the town hall today is the figure of Thomas Attwood, a Birmingham banker who led a campaign for political reform. The main aim of the movement was to win the masses the right to vote, rather than just the landed gentry. On the 7th of May 1832, a crowd of 200,000 gathered on Newhall Hill for a reform meeting led by Attwood. By now, the movement had gained momentum nationally, and revolution was in the air. Within a month of this huge gathering, the first reform bill was rushed through Parliament. 6 months later, Thomas Attwood and Josiah Schofield were elected Birmingham's first MPs. While Attwood was orchestrating his reform campaign, a new transport revolution was gathering pace. In 1832, bills were passed authorising railways to be constructed from Birmingham to Liverpool and Birmingham to London. In July 1837, the Liverpool line was complete, and by 6 o'clock in the morning of the official opening, the streets leading to a siding at Vauxhall were thronged with people. At 7 o'clock, to the accompaniment of a brass band and thousands of cheering people, the steam locomotive Wildfire, pulling 8 carriages full of dignitaries, set off for Liverpool. The crowd was awestruck as the hissing, snorting monster reached the astonishing speed of 35 miles an hour, quickly disappearing into the distance. In August the following year, the Birmingham to London line opened with a grand terminus in Curzon Street. Birmingham's population had now grown to more than 150,000, but its system of local government was still more or less unchanged from medieval times, obviously hopelessly inadequate for such a populous town. In 1838, Queen Victoria granted Birmingham a charter of incorporation that allowed it to elect an official body to handle the town's affairs. A grand banquet was organised at the town hall to coincide with the arrival of the charter by rail from London. The gathered dignitaries were left twiddling their thumbs somewhat when the document failed to arrive. It eventually turned up in Belfast and was hastily dispatched to its rightful destination. Despite the odd slip-up, the railway soon proved successful, but it was widely felt that Birmingham would benefit greatly from a more central terminus. In many places, the cost of bringing the railway into the town centre was prohibitive because of the amount of property that would have to be bought for both the line and the station. Birmingham's geography made it far more economical. The only land required was for the station itself. Access was gained by tunnelling through the sandstone ridge. Trains run through underground tunnels and the passengers pop out above. Snow Hill Station opened in 1852 as the terminus of the Great Western Line, followed 2 years later by Navigation Street Station on the North Western. It was later renamed New Street Station. The 15th of June 1858 was a memorable day in Birmingham's civic history. Queen Victoria and her consort Prince Albert came to town, the first ever visit by a ruling monarch. Aston was the nearest they'd come before, when Charles I stayed there during the Civil War. Ironically, the reason for this royal visit was to open Aston Hall and Grounds as a public amusement park. Crowds lined the route from Snow Hill Station as the royal party made their way to an official reception at the town hall. The Queen later declared the park well and truly open. It quickly became one of the most popular resorts in the Midlands, although some of its attractions began to cause some raised eyebrows among the more stern members of Victorian society. Things came to a head in 1863 when a female tightrope walker fell to her death. The matter came to the attention of the Queen, who was definitely not amused. She wrote to the Mayor Charles Sturge, expressing her displeasure at one of her subjects being sacrificed for the gratification of the public. To save everyone's embarrassment, the council bought the estate and guaranteed a more dignified future. It was the first corporation in the country to own a stately home, and historic Aston Hall and its grounds are still owned by the council today. Queen Victoria's tastes also had an impact on another aspect of Birmingham, this time indirectly. Her passion for jewellery made it more fashionable, and business for the town's manufacturers was booming. Unlike most of the other metal trades, jewellery had resisted the move into factories, relying still on individual craftsmen. Furthermore, it was comparatively easy to set up in business. All that was required was a range of tools, a small workshop, the gas jet rented from the gas company, and a considerable amount of skill. At the start of Queen Victoria's reign, there were around 100 jewellers in Birmingham. By 1870 there were 482, with more than 10,000 people dependent in some way on the trade. To satisfy the demand for space in the jewellery quarter, houses were divided up into several workshops and extended into gardens, a process known as shopping. Shell's 19th century trade directory said of Birmingham, "Its jewellers now stand foremost in all matters of taste and design, the workmen of today ranking as artists indeed, even the commonest gilt jewellery turned out by them now being of high-class design and frequently of most elaborate workmanship." At its peak, around 70,000 people were involved in the trade in some way. The town became the undisputed centre of Britain's jewellery trade and is still renowned for the quality of its products. Many aspects of the industry have changed little. The jewellery quarter is still the centre of the country's jewellery trade and a rare example of a Victorian working district. Another entry in Shell's directory shows the growing importance of another local industry. In 1865 it was estimated that the quantity of metal used here in the manufacture of brass is 19,000 tonnes of copper, 8,000 tonnes of old metal, 11,000 tonnes of zinc or spelter, 200 tonnes of tin and 100 tonnes of lead, the total value being more than £2 million. Anything and everything made of brass came from Birmingham, from bedsteads to the doorknobs in Buckingham Palace. Although the gleaming end product belied the unpleasant working conditions in the brass foundries. Visitors to Birmingham may have been surprised, and perhaps slightly amused, at the sight of the large number of townsmen with green hair from the fumes produced in certain stages of the brass-making process. But for many of Birmingham's working classes, green hair was the least of their problems. People had continued to flood into the town, eager to be part of its success, many of them unskilled, so many in fact that labourers' wages began to fall. The poverty line in mid-Victorian England was around 18 shillings a week. An unskilled Birmingham manual worker could earn only about 15 shillings. The pawn shop was a regular necessity for a large number of families, and any church relief or free meals were snapped up gratefully. But people kept on coming. Cheap, hastily built housing was erected for rent to the newcomers, the back-to-back courts that blighted the achievements of the Industrial Revolution. Even the majestic town hall was hemmed in on three sides by these squalid slums. Long, double rows of homes arranged back-to-back under one roof, with one room downstairs and two up. All but the end house had three party walls, allowing only one for light and ventilation. Entries between alternate front doors led to further blocks, arranged around courtyards containing communal toilets and water pumps. Life was tough in Birmingham's poorest areas. Some of the courts became no-go areas, and gangs known as the Birmingham Roughs gained national notoriety. More violent deaths occurred through crime here than anywhere else in the country. This was bad enough, but the greatest threat to life came from overcrowding itself. There were no sewers, and the night soilmen, whose job it was to cart out the daily mountains of human waste, simply couldn't do it fast enough. It began to seep through the poorer sandstone and polluted the water supply, poisoning the people forced to drink it. the average death rate in the slums was more than double Birmingham's overall average, and 1 in 5 children died before it could walk. The stench from the slums, combined with smoke and fumes from thousands of factories, brass foundries and forges, had caused Birmingham's businessmen to evacuate the town. The railways had made it possible for some to commute from semi-rural areas like Sutton and Solihull, but others preferred to live closer to their place of work. Realising the demand for high-quality homes near the town centre, the Calthorpe family developed Edgbaston as an upmarket suburb for Birmingham's businessmen. Houses here cost as much as £2,000, when £150 could buy a reasonable worker's cottage. To maintain the estate's exclusivity, the Calthorpes banned any industrial and commercial activity, including shops and pubs. A list of the inhabitants of Victorian Edgbaston read like a who's who of eminent Brummies. Avery, Kenrick, Cadbury, Martineau all found homes here, and the most famous of them all, Joseph Chamberlain. He was born in London, but came to Birmingham to run the family screw business, Nettlefold and Chamberlain. He became a local councillor, and in 1873, aged 33, was elected mayor. Since the town's incorporation, the council had been pretty ineffective in dealing with the huge social problems caused by its rapid expansion. The old street commissioners had stubbornly clung to power, blocking the new body at every opportunity. But the main problem was that there was simply no precedent for dealing with the situation it faced. Newly industrialised towns all over Britain were struggling to cope with overcrowding and slum conditions, and were short of answers. What was needed was someone with the vision, dynamism and determination to take the drastic action needed. Birmingham found those qualities in Joseph Chamberlain. He vowed that, with God's help, the town will not know itself. Sweeping aside all objections to cost, he instigated the purchase of the 2 gas companies and the waterworks, so they could be expanded and modernised under municipal control. He appointed a medical officer of health, organised the paving of the streets, extended street lighting, and appointed a drainage authority to improve the sewage system. He supervised the clearance of 90 acres of the worst slums and built Corporation Street on the site. In 3 successive terms as mayor, he transformed Birmingham and provided a role model that showed the way ahead for towns and cities all over the country. Chamberlain became an MP for Birmingham in 1876, but the boldness he had instilled in the council continued. Bull Street, New Street and Colmore Row were rebuilt in the style of Corporation Street. A new home was built for the council, the foundation stone appropriately laid by Brummagem Joe. And in 1884, a new museum and art gallery was built. Queen Victoria came to Birmingham again in 1887 to open the Victoria Law Courts, and must have been astonished at the transformation since her first visit 29 years earlier. She was obviously impressed, because 2 years later she conferred on Birmingham the status of city. The little manufacturing town that had grown up on the banks of the Ray had come of age. Its boundaries were extended, and it began to gobble up ancient settlements that became suburbs of the new city, with a population now approaching 500,000. When Queen Victoria died in 1901, she was deeply mourned in Birmingham. Council Square was renamed Victoria Square in her honour, and pride of place was given to her statue. 1904 saw the completion of an incredibly ambitious scheme to solve once and for all the city's water supply problem. Birmingham bought 45,000 acres of the Cambrian Mountains, including the valley of the River Elan, and built 3 huge dams. The water that gathers behind them is piped to reservoirs at Frankley and then to every home in the city. By now, a new electrified tram system was spreading its tentacles out from the city centre, replacing the old steam trams that were infamous for the noise and smoke that followed them. The first route to be improved was the Bristol Road to Selly Oak, and, as the network spread, it brought great benefits to the inhabitants. The only green areas easily accessible from the city were a handful of parks donated by wealthy individuals. The largest, Cannon Hill Park, which took its name from a piece of artillery left behind in the Civil War, was packed with people after a bit of fresh air. In 1907, the electric tramway was extended through Erdington to the Sutton Coldfield boundary. Huge numbers of people from Birmingham now took the tram to the Erdington terminus and walked to Sutton Park to enjoy its wide open spaces. This was despite the fact that the entrance charge to non-residents of Sutton had recently doubled to twopence. In the same year, moves to provide Birmingham with its own bit of natural countryside began when the Cadbury brothers bought Beacon Hill in the Lickies and donated it to the city. A few years later, the corporation bought Bilberry Hill and Cofton Hill, and the set was completed when the Cadburys bought the Rose and Crown estate. A common sight on the roads crossing the Lickey Hills in the early years of the 20th century was a young man test driving prototype vehicles made down the road at Longbridge. His name was Herbert Austin, and he was determined to be part of a new transport revolution. In 1901 he'd taken over a derelict printing works at Longbridge, and within a few years had built his first four-cylinder touring car. By 1909, the first of his famous Austin 7s that would become a common sight on the city streets rolled off the production line. But soon, events in Europe began to dominate the news. On the announcement of the outbreak of World War I, BSA workers were recalled from holiday and commenced round-the-clock production. Soon, 10,000 Lee Enfield rifles were leaving the Small Heath factory every week. Thousands of young Brummies answered the call to arms and proudly marched off to war. Many never returned, and in 1923 the Hall of Memory was built in their honour. In 1924, electrification of the Bristol Road tram line was extended to Rednall and quickly became one of Birmingham's most popular routes. On a sunny Easter Monday, the Rednall 70 carried more than 10,000 city dwellers from the Navigation Street terminus to explore the Lickey Hills. Trams were drafted in from all over the city and worked late into the night to ensure everyone got back home. In July 1927, the weather contrived to cause more chaos in Birmingham, this time in less jovial fashion. Violent storms caused the River Ray to rise rapidly. The Austin works were out of action for 2 days. Play was stopped at Edgbaston Cricket Ground and many Digbeth businesses were flooded out. The decision was taken to make sure the temperamental little river could cause no more trouble. A series of weirs upstream of Birmingham slowed the flow, and as it approached the city centre it was encased in a blue brick jacket. The Ray was finally disowned by the city it had spawned. "1938 was a year of great celebration in Birmingham. It was 100 years since the town had received its Charter of Incorporation. The culmination of the centenary events was a grand pageant in the grounds of Aston Hall, which reenacted scenes from the city's past, although perhaps with a little poetic licence here and there. Among the guests of honour was Birmingham-born Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. In September of the following year, he had a more unpleasant duty to perform.
I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
It was inevitable that the scale of the city's industry would make it a prime target for Hitler's air force, and thousands of city children were evacuated to safe areas, while preparations were made to protect those left behind. The first bombs fell on Erdington on the 9th of August 1940, killing one and injuring 6 others. This was a taste of far worse to come. At the height of the Blitz in October, November and December of 1940, raids came almost every night, and incendiaries and bombs wreaked terrible havoc. A brief respite was followed in April 1941 by the most ferocious attack yet, which left 1,200 dead. The total death toll in Birmingham was 2,241, with more than 3,000 seriously injured. But Birmingham could fight back. Throughout these dark days its industries kept going, and arms produced at the BSA and planes produced at Longbridge and Castle Bromwich eventually helped turn the tide in Britain's favour. Understandably, the end of war was greeted with great jubilation in Birmingham. With the celebrations over, the city began the huge task of clearing away the debris of nearly 12,000 homes and a host of public and commercial buildings, either destroyed or left unsafe by enemy bombs. One, though, was retained, just as Hitler had left it. In December 1940, St Thomas's Church in Holloway Head had suffered a direct hit, leaving only the spire standing. And here it stands today, the focal point of a peace garden, and a lasting reminder of one of the grimmest periods in Birmingham's history. Ironically, many of the homes destroyed by the Luftwaffe were inner city slums, which saved the council the cost of doing it themselves. To solve the immediate housing shortage, prefabricated houses were erected wherever there was space. These early post-war prefabs in Moseley still provide cosy homes for their occupants and are now listed buildings. The late 40s and early 50s saw a major programme of municipal house building in the suburbs, which saw them expand rapidly and the city centre left uninhabited. By now, cars had become affordable for a larger percentage of the population, and towns and cities all over the country, having only just about come to terms with overcrowded housing, were now struggling with congested roads. In Birmingham, all sorts of experiments to control traffic took place, including the construction of a temporary flyover to take the pressure off the bottleneck Camp Hill Junction. As it turned out, the structure proved more durable than anticipated and was a unique feature of Birmingham's traffic control system for decades. Meanwhile, more permanent measures centred on the construction in the 1960s of the Queensway, Birmingham's inner ring road. The 60s redevelopment also included a radical transformation of the old Bullring. When it was created, the Bullring Centre, incorporating the then controversial Rotunda, was Europe's largest indoor shopping precinct. The 60s also saw the appearance of another Birmingham landmark. The BT Tower receives and transmits TV and radio signals and provides a vital cog in the nation's communications network. Throughout its history, access to and from Birmingham has always been a key factor in its development, and it would continue to be crucial to its future. The city found itself at the heart of the national motorway network, and in 1971, Gravelly Hill Interchange, better known as Spaghetti Junction, became the new gateway to Birmingham. Meanwhile, the canals, which had been such a benefit to its industries 200 years earlier, had slipped into dereliction and neglect. Unfortunately, Birmingham's industries themselves were also in decline. BSA closed in 1975. The Longbridge Car Works was relying on government subsidies to keep afloat, and many other trades were suffering from underinvestment and foreign competition. The 1980s, what's happened since has been nothing short of astonishing. Birmingham has, quite simply, reinvented itself. The growing success of the National Exhibition Centre marked the first move away from total dependence on manufacturing. The centenary of Birmingham becoming a city in 1889 provided a good reason to begin a transformation of the city centre. By 1989, the Gardens of Remembrance had become Centenary Square. 2 years later, the Queen opened the ICC, the UK's first purpose-built convention centre, built on the site of Bingley Hall. As the momentum gained pace, old warehouses lining stagnant canal basins became an indoor arena, a sea life centre, hotels, bars, cafes, nightclubs and swish waterside apartments. New businesses decided they wanted to be part of Birmingham's future, and while industry was still important to its commercial success, it was now supported by a rapidly expanding financial services and information technology sector. Pedestrianisation of Victoria Square and New Street gave this bit of Birmingham back to the people and provided an opportunity to introduce some interesting new additions. As confidence grew, private and public money flooded in and enhancement projects mushroomed, breathing new life into the old parts of town. More recently, attention has turned to the bullring. The ancient markets have a brand new home, and the site of the 60 shopping centre, flattened in just 8 months, is the largest city centre retail regeneration scheme in Europe. As the city's renaissance continues, a new Birmingham is taking shape. An exciting, vibrant Birmingham. A Birmingham we can all be proud of.